So I just wanted to do a quick video of the probable passage strategy. I usually use it with multiple students at a time, but it's definitely adaptable to a one-on-one situation. Um, and I like it because it's a good pre-thinking activity for before you read. And it also gives me a pretty good idea usually of what their vocabulary knowledge is in relation to the story, as well as background knowledge, because I pick the terms that they're focusing on and then they work through the process of categorizing them. So to explain a little bit better, I just chose, for example, Twilight is the first thing that came to my mind. And I came up with 3, 6, 9, about 10-ish terms. Usually I try to come up with at least 12 to 15. So it'll take a while to really fit those into place. But the idea is that you pick terms that fit into the categories of characters, setting, problem or conflict, and then outcomes of the story. So you've got those 4 main boxes that they choose words to stick in the box based on where they think it fits. And it gives them kind of a basis to go off then for predicting what the story is about. So after they've placed each of the terms that you provide them, then they're able to use the middle part here to write maybe a sentence or two about what they predict the story might be about. And I try to encourage them to use at least a decent chunk of the terms or phrases that I have given them. It gets a little messy if you ask them to use too many of them, but to say, try and use at least half is usually a pretty good goal. Then you also have down here a box that says unknown words or phrases. I only let students put terms there if they literally do not know what it means or it's a word that they've never seen before, and that happens sometimes. So if they seem familiar with it at all, I encourage them just to place it in some way, and usually talk about, what do you think it means and where does that mean that it's most likely to fit. Really what throws them off most of the time is problems and outcomes. Those are easy to interchange. And it depends on how difficult you want to make the terms. You have a lot of choice in what words or phrases you pick out. So if you want to pick easier things to start with, you can. I usually try and challenge the students just to get them thinking about, okay, this could go both places, and maybe have them explain why could it fit here or why could it fit there. But ultimately they have to choose. They can't put it in more than one place. You could allow that. It's up to you. But unknown words and phrases, I say, if you have any inclination of what it might mean, I want you to place it in one of the other boxes. And then I always make them come up with 3 questions. If it's a shorter text, you could say, come up with at least 2. I always encourage my students to come up with 3 just because it's better to ask more questions. And then as they read later on, I'll have them use the back of the sheet to maybe rewrite some of their predictions and say, okay, we've gotten halfway through the text. What do you think it's about now, or how do you predict it might end? Questions like that. We also will move terms around. So let's say they put friendship as an outcome, but really we find out that friendship is part of the problem. So when we get to that point, we pause in the story and I say, okay, do you have any terms that you want to move? Which ones? Where are they currently? Where do you want to put them and why? Most of the time I will have them point to specific sentences or paragraphs in the story that can help them explain why. So say, okay, you say you want to move friendship from outcomes to problem up here, that's fine, I accept that, but can you explain to me your reasoning? Or is there a paragraph in the story that gives us a specific example of why friendship is a problem and not a resolution to a problem? And I like to use these terms as we go through it just to really reinforce that these are the elements of a story, and it helps them understand better, I think, how all of those interact with each other. And as they read, they learn more about the terms, which I think just naturally helps develop the vocabulary, especially if it's an unknown word and they can discover later on where to put it. It gives them a more contextual definition of what that word means beyond just saying werewolf means this. And I also make them answer their questions. They sometimes will come up with questions that you can't answer. I think that's perfectly fine, but I will push them at least to find some answer, if at all. And if they are questions that you can't answer, then we always have a conversation about, was that a good question? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, just depends. But really with each individual step of working through this activity, I usually end up having it take, it takes a while as a pre-reading activity and also as something that we return back to as we're reading, because I am pretty consistently, maybe after every couple pages, let's say if we're reading a story or a longer book, going back and saying, okay, are you happy with where everything is at? So we do a lot of erasing, crossing out. Sometimes with something that's really heavy, if I give them a lot of terms and it's more difficult, I'll give them a second copy of the sheet that's blank and say, okay, now rewrite it, reorganize everything so that they have really a final visual of where everything fits, because it does get a little messy and sometimes that flusters some students if they're trying to move too much around too often. So giving them a second draft is not always a bad idea. But you can kind of feel that out and see if it works for you, try it out. And if it doesn't seem like it's going that well, or if she's getting burnt out on on constantly having to revisit it, you can back off a little bit, doesn't matter. Sometimes I abandon it, or I say, we've read enough of it, we've gone back to this enough, let's just finish the story for the sake of finishing it. It just depends. It's successful with most texts. Sometimes it's hard. Really what seems to be the best gauge for that is if they really don't have the background knowledge for understanding the story in the first place, the chances of this being successful diminish, or are diminished. But hopefully that's not the case. So I'm going to stop rambling about this. Hopefully you find it useful. I really like it. It's something I use, fairly often, not all the time, but at least once or twice in a unit with a couple different stories. And it's nice because then students get in the habit of understanding, here's what we're doing, and they take it more seriously. And I've had a lot of luck with it, so hopefully you do too.